And it's not because we get to eat the chocolate delicious eggs, but because this is the time where I get to reckon with why I believe what I believe. All right, the resurrection of Jesus, why I'm a Christian. And I used to tell people, kind of tongue-in-cheek, when I first became a Christian, that I had to convert my inner atheist. And then I got into ministry, and I realized that had a different flavor to it, so I probably need to rephrase things to clarify what I mean by that. Actually, funny story. We took our youth group back in California to a winter retreat up in the Redwoods in California. And we brought our kids up there, and the directors of the camp gathered all of the youth workers together in this room. And they just kind of wanted to introduce everybody to each other, find out who we were, where we came from, and just kind of pray over the week. And so they went around the room and they asked a series of questions. You know, what is your name? Where do you come from? And what's an interesting fact about you? And I don't typically have the spiritual gift of being quick-witted. But every once in a while I get a moment or two. But anyways, it got to me, everything is lighthearted and happy. And so it came to me and I said, well, hi, I'm Skylar. We come from Grover Beach, California. Interesting fact about me that nobody knows. I said, So, well, I'm a youth pastor at our church and I'm an atheist. And it's like instantly the air just got sucked out of the room and this look of dread just washed over everybody's face. And I let this hang for about 15 long seconds before I just kind of told everybody I was joking, and everyone burst in laughter, mostly because of relief, because that would have been a really awkward camp for them to kind of navigate around me. But it was alarming to hear a youth pastor say that they were an atheist, and equally, it's odd for me to say the phrase, I have to convert my inner atheist. So here's what I meant. What I meant was that since I became a Christian, I have often wrestled with doubts. I've often had questions, and I have had to take myself by the hand and walk myself down to the cross and to the empty tomb to remind myself why I am a Christian. Why I can reasonably believe what I claim to believe. And the place I would go is Jesus' resurrection. It's the Easter message. And I feel that there is so much overwhelming proof for the arguments in favor of Jesus rising from the dead that for me, it had this distilling effect that would just kind of resolve a lot of my doubts that I had. Now, I don't feel like I need to do this as often now, but every so often I do have doubts that I have to wrestle with, and I walk myself back to the cross and to the empty tomb to resolve my doubts. And typically on an Easter message like today, I approach things in a sort of apologetic way. That is, giving a defense, giving proofs for why we can believe in the resurrection of Jesus. But I want to do things different today. Instead of standing up here and talking about all of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I want to talk about why we should want to believe in the resurrection. Why this should be something that we desire. And so that's where we're going today. Not here's why you should believe in the resurrection, but here's why you should want the resurrection of Jesus to be true. And I should add, regardless of your background, regardless of where you come when in regards to faith, whether you have faith or you don't have faith, right? If you don't know what to believe, you should want the resurrection of Jesus to be true. If you're somebody who affiliates with a different faith tradition or religion, you should want Jesus' resurrection to be true. If you are an atheist, you should want Jesus' resurrection to be true. If you are a Christian, you should want Jesus' resurrection to be true. And I would argue that our outlook on life, our eternity, how we view what religion is the right religion, if we can know things to be objectively true, if we can have meaning, why there is suffering, and a bunch of questions on those lines is answered when we answer the question, did Jesus rise from the grave? The expression to kill two birds with one stone is very true with the resurrection, but instead of two birds, you have like 1,000 birds with one stone, right? That is the magnitude of Jesus' resurrection. realizing that he rose from the dead adds incredible significance to all of the answers we give, to all of the questions we have, and even to the value and meaning of life. So why should we want the resurrection to be true? Well, before we get there, if it's okay with you, let me just give you one proof, one overwhelming thing that convinces me. If you read through the gospel stories, that's the biographies of Jesus, and you take a look at the disciple, right, the apostles, the ones who follow Jesus around constantly, you walk away with several impressions about them. One of them is that for most of Jesus' ministry, they have no idea who Jesus is and what he's teaching. Like, they are clueless. And in fact, there you could see that there's fundamental differences, fundamental misunderstandings that they have about Jesus, especially on some very important points. But the most profound picture that you get of the disciples is that they are sometimes impulsive, but they're very timid and fearful, especially when it came to Jesus' cross. This comes clearest when he's crucified. And for 3 years, he invests his life into 12 men, and they follow Jesus around. They know Jesus' teaching. They know his way of life. And then in a turn of what seems like unfortunate events, Jesus gets marched off of the Mount of Olives. He is wrongly tried, and then he is crucified. His death, it is so real, it is so vivid, it is so grotesque that you don't have any of the gospel writers finding any need to describe what took place on the cross, because simply saying the word cross, it invoked the smells, it invoked the cries, the humiliation of this awful event. And everyone was so sure that Jesus' death had taken place, that it wasn't an accident, that he didn't pass out, but they were so convinced that Jesus died, that the authorities, they thought, the disciples of Jesus, they're going to come in the middle of the night, they're going to steal Jesus' body and stage this whole thing to make it look like Jesus rose from the dead. And so they posted their top security guards of their day at Jesus' tomb to make sure that didn't happen. But if you've ever experienced the weight of losing somebody that you love to a tragic death, you know that it takes all of yourself, all of your energy just to make it through the day, let alone be able to pull off a stunt like this. And to make matters worse, the disciples are they're all thinking the same thing. They're thinking, look, if this is what they did to our leader, we're next in line. They're going to march us off next to be crucified. And so what did they do? Here's what they did. John 20, verse 19. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders. They're terrified. They are grieving. They are fearful that they are next. They are going to be crucified. Well, then Jesus, as the gospel tells us, he's resurrected and he appears before them with a real physical resurrected body, and something in the disciples change. They go from these grieving cowards to celebratory preachers. And the boldness just astounds everyone, right? Luke describes one moment like this in Acts chapter 4, verse 13. He says, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished. And they took note that these men had been with Jesus. It's often asked, what could it have been to change somebody from being fearful and grieving to being bold and confident? I mean, something inside the disciples changed. It shifted. Not a year later, not a month later, not a few weeks later, but days after Jesus' crucifixion. And this caused them to stand before the very people who signed Jesus' death penalty, and they boldly proclaimed, hey, you killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. I mean, these are the same ones who killed Jesus. And they posted guards at the tomb. And all that it would have taken to just completely undermine the Christian message is to say, hey guys, you clearly, you're clueless. Let's go to the tomb. We'll show you Jesus' body. And they couldn't do it. They didn't do it. Because the problem was the tomb was empty. And in fact, years later, the message of Jesus' resurrection, it becomes so widespread throughout the Roman Empire that a Roman emperor, he writes into law this law that in essence says that there will be serious consequences for anybody who would tamper with the graves of dead people. Why would that need to be written into law if nothing happened Easter morning? What proof would you need to go from grieving, fearful people to the boldest preachers who have ever lived on this planet? Why, if this was a lie, would all of the early witnesses of Jesus be willing to put their life on the line? In fact, many of them died for the message. Well, the answer is because something remarkable happened that first Easter that changed the disciples' lives, which ended up changing the world. So let's talk about that change that happened to them. When you take serious what the New Testament says about Jesus, you realize that not only does it give us hope beyond death, but it changes life today. It's a message of life change. When you believe in Jesus' death and resurrection, and you surrender your life to Him, something happens in us. Something changes in us. And that something appears to be a part of what happened to the disciples after Jesus rose. And most people, and you probably think this way, most people are familiar with the idea that the Bible teaches us that we have hope of an afterlife after this life. And that's true. We have a hope beyond the grave. And so many people think that Easter, the resurrection of Jesus, is simply about what Jesus did to get people into heaven. That's the accumulation of the Easter message. Jesus died, He rose, so we can have a place in heaven. Can I be honest for a moment? That wasn't the change that took place in the early disciples. That wasn't the change that caused them to have great boldness. They didn't go, hey, now we know where we're going because Jesus rose from the dead. There was something inside of them that was brought back to life. There was something that was dead that was raised back to life because of what Jesus did. And Jesus Himself, He indicates that this would happen to people when they believe, that something in us that is dead would be resurrected. And Jesus didn't say, hey, when you believe in me, I will give you hope for the end of your life. Actually, Jesus makes a subtle but different point altogether, that what would happen to believers when we believed in His resurrection. When Mary and Martha, when they lost their brother, Jesus shows up. And He comforts them with a message of the resurrection, that Jesus is the resurrection and life. But here's how this exchange went. John chapter 11, verse 21. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Do you hear what Martha is saying to Jesus? She is saying, Jesus, yes. We know what happens at the end of our life. We know what happens when we die. We know we're going to be raised to life, and we are so grateful that we have this hope in a time like this. But look at what Jesus says. Because He refocuses her attention on what belief in Jesus means. Verse 25. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life, and the one who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Jesus says the resurrection event that you are looking forward to, Martha, it is a person, and He is standing before you right now. You look forward to that day, but I am the one who imparts resurrection life to people. When you believe in me, you are really living. You're like fully alive. And this life, it begins at belief in Jesus, and it reaches its finished product at the end of our life. That it reaches completion when we get to the other side of life. In other words, like when you believe in Jesus, He begins this process of changing your life. And that process reaches its completion when we get to the other side of our tomb. In fact, the Apostle Paul, he writes in Ephesians that the way we should be thinking about our life before Christ and coming to Christ is in this framework of seeing our life from being transferred from dying to being alive, from being brought from death to life. Here's what he says, Ephesians 2 verse 1. He says, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins." And skip down to verse 4. He says, "But because of His great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. And God raised us up with Christ and seated us with Him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus." This is a powerful and relevant passage for so many reasons. Not only because that Paul, when he talks about salvation, when he talks about us believing in Jesus, he talks about us being transferred from the realm of death into the realm of life. We have been moved from being dead to being alive. But it's also significant because look what he says in verse 6. And take note that Paul has the words raised up and seated us, and they are not in the future tense. They're in the aorist. And that might not mean much to you, but the significance of what Paul is saying isn't that this is something that Christians are hoping for down the road, which is true, but the subtle message is that's happening now. That right now, through belief in Jesus' resurrection, we have been raised up. We have been seated on the victory seat with Christ. Victory is now. That's what Paul's saying. It's true. As Christians, we have a real and we have a tangible hope after death that is surely there. That is unmovable. That is there. But for some reason, the Bible wants us to understand that God does something in our life now, today. God is at work. That when we believe in Him, He does something inside of us, and that begins this process of God working in our life that finishes its end when we die. God completes His work on our death. Jesus' resurrection doesn't change simply our perspective on life. It actually changes our life. God wants Christians not just to have their sights focused toward the end, but what God does now. In fact, in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, he has this remarkable line about God's work in our life. And here's what he says, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. And Paul says, "And we all with unveiled faces," the people in the Old Testament, they could not stand before God and stand before all of His glory. And so they would put a veil over their faces to hide themselves from seeing God's glory, face to face, if you will. And Paul's saying that veil has been removed, and now we can see God's glory in His fullness in Jesus. Right? Beholding the glory of the Lord, we are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. Paul says that Christ's work in our life is transformation from one degree of glory to another degree of glory. God transforms our life so that our lives look like Christ. And this is an ongoing, lifelong process. But it reaches its finished work, another degree of glory, upon leaving our life. And so one might ask Paul, hey Paul, why is that important, right? I mean, we still have hope. Why is knowing this, why does this matter? Well, here's what he says in the next chapter. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 1. He says, therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. Paul goes, look, we have this unbelievable ministry where our lives, we're experiencing transformation. And look, we get to see people being transformed. People are actually being changed because of the gospel from one degree of glory to another. And because of that, guys, we don't lose heart. And Paul, why would you even lose heart? And Paul says this, for the simple fact of this, verses 8 through 11. Hey, he says, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. Paul says, guys, it has been an unbelievably hard road. And it's so easy to get discouraged from all of the opposition that we faced from town to town. And Paul goes, but you know what that's like? It feels like we're literally a walking embodiment of Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus' suffering, it's like that's what it feels like for us. Verse 10. Paul says, we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be also revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that His life may be revealed in our mortal bodies. A tad morbid and slightly depressing to think about your life meaning as carrying around the death of Jesus, right? But Paul goes, but that's where we find a great, overwhelming degree of comfort and encouragement. Because as we go through all of this hardship, we see this as accomplishing something more. It is forming us into the very image of Jesus. In fact, he says that God's glory is being put on display through all of the hardship that He's enduring. He says it's like this light that's shining into our hearts, and that light is radiating out of us. Verse 6. For God, who said, let the light shine out of darkness, made His light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. The more hits we take, Paul says, the greater the light becomes. Which I think we can understand, right? Because, we know the passage. In all things, God works for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Yes, Paul, we see that God is using your obstacles to put His glory on display. But Paul says, but it's not simply that God is displaying His glory in our circumstance. It's actually that He is doing something inside of us because of those circumstances. Paul says something that is completely shocking to me. Here's what he says in verse 16. He says, therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Paul says that his suffering, his hardship that he is going through for Jesus, it feels like death to him. It feels like I'm dying. But it's actually producing something far more glorious than what anyone would have ever dare dreamed. It's almost hidden. It's like a clay pot. It's easily breakable, right? And God takes His glorious presence and He places His glorious presence inside of our life. And we have this glorious treasure, this glorious presence in this jar of clay. And hardships and trouble, though they are only momentary, they are incredibly painful. Paul says they feel like I'm dying. And it's like this hammer. It takes a swing at that clay pot and it cracks it, it breaks it, it shatters it, splintering it. And the more that happens, the more that the glory shines. And it's almost like Paul is saying, hey, look, this is the time that we were abandoned. Hey, this is the time. Do you remember this, Paul, when John Mark left you? Oh, hey, Paul, do you remember that time where you fought wild animals in the Colosseum? Paul, do you remember when you were in that city, you were preaching the gospel, God was doing incredible things, and there was this coup to try to murder you? And remember, Paul, when you heard about all of what the churches went through, how there was this incredible amount of suffering, and you were up all night agonizing and praying for the churches, and then you got word, Paul, some of the people that you baptized died. You remember this, Paul? And it's like Paul goes, you know what? The more that life has taken a swing at me and my clay pot begins to shatter and break, with the greater the swing, the more God's glory shines through me. God does not simply find a way to get us through the hardship that we experience. God has a way of transforming us through the hardship we go through. That when suffering and a hardship comes, God can use it for His purpose in our life to achieve within us a greater amount of glory, and that shines through the cracks in our life. Trouble and hardship have been the tools that God uses in His toolbox to move us along in the process of changing from one degree of glory into another. And the greater the hit, the greater the crack, the greater the chance of God's transforming work in our life. And Paul says, look, knowing that in spite of the hardship I go through, God is using even that to change me. He says, guys, I don't lose heart because of my hardship, because I know what happens with those cracks in my life. It is changing me. It is producing in me something far more glorious than what anyone can imagine. In fact, Paul says in Romans chapter 8 that if we could hold up these cracks, these damages, and we were to compare them with the work, God's finished work of what God would do in our life, we wouldn't even want to compare the two. Romans 8:18 says this. Paul says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. One of my favorite comments on this truth comes from C.S. Lewis in his book, The Great Divorce. But he writes this fiction story. But in it says, these mortals do not understand that heaven, once attained, works backwards to change, to turn even that agony into glory. And I love that perspective. That the glory of heaven, it doesn't just rectify our past, it repurposes our past. And part of what Paul is getting at here in this passage is saying that part of what God's work is doing now is to transform us through these cracks. Part of God's finished work has begun now, that God is doing this right now. He is transforming us through the hardship. And Paul goes, look, it's kind of a challenging teaching to accept, let alone see, right? Because let's face it, when we go through hardship, it's hard for us to see anything beyond that. It's hard for us to see any good coming from the stuff that we go through. And Paul reminds them in Corinth, and he reminds us of this truth. Verse 18. He says, so we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. We trust that by taking a few hits in our life, getting bruised up, getting hurt, going through trouble, it's hard to see beyond that. It's hard to see beyond those cracks. But God has not called us to trust what we see. God has called us to trust what we do not see, which is His work in our life through these. That God produces something far greater in our life through our hardship than what we could ever imagine when we are trusting Him. And it is that change which transformed the apostles from these fearful, grieving skeptics into these bold-filled preachers. For them, God's suffering to bring about a new life, it wasn't a happy metaphor. It was a person. His name was Jesus. And Jesus didn't just change their perspective, He changed their life. I mean, it was Jesus, and suddenly the message that Jesus had been saying for all of those 3 years, it finally clicked. The disciples got it. And there was something powerful at work in them when they understood it. And it gave them this fresh boldness, this hope. So to return to the original question, why should we want to believe in the resurrection of Jesus? Why should we desire this? Well, the simple answer is this. It gives us hope. It gives us hope. Paul says this in Romans chapter 5. He says, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Why, Paul, does that character that is fraught against all of this suffering, how is it and why is it that it produces hope? Paul goes on and in essence says it's not because of the durability of our clay pot. This isn't what gives us hope. This isn't what gives us stability. It's because of what is inside of the pot that does that. Romans 5:5. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our heart through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. The simple answer to why you should want the resurrection of Jesus to be true is because it gives us hope. Not a wish-washy hope that gets us through the day, but a real, tangible hope that deals with the fullness of life, with all that the yuck and the hardship that we go through in life. It gives us hope in that. The resurrection of Jesus, it reassures us that all of our heartbreak, all of the abuses, all of the disappointments, all of our sufferings, including death, it will one day be reworked to such a degree that we won't even want to compare what we went through with what God did through that. Because it far outweighs them all. And some religions in the world, they teach you that suffering, it is an illusion. It's an illusion. The sooner you can just get past that and move on with your life, the happier you will be. Some religions advocate for a karma system that says, in essence, suffering is your consequence that you are paying in your life. And you just need to accept it and let everybody else get on with their sentence in life. Atheism, because it denies the existence of God, also denies that we can know anything as objectively good or evil. And so suffering and evil, in a sense, is just kind of the natural part of our world. Get over it. Accept it. It's what it is. And Jesus comes along and He says, no, suffering, it's real. It's not an illusion. It's hard. And it was not a part of God's plan for your life. It never was. Instead of denying its existence, Jesus enters into human existence. He suffers and He dies for us to give us hope beyond the grave, and hope that we can carry around in our lives today. And rather than saying, hey, you know what? Your suffering is you getting what you deserve, Paul says, no, God is so good that He gives us something in the midst of suffering that produces something even greater than any of the pain can take away from your life. The reason you should want the resurrection to be true is because it tells us that our sufferings, they are not meaningless. And that life can be more than this accumulation of scars. But here's the thing about this hope. What gives us the strength to endure hardship, what has the power to re-engineer meaning in the midst of suffering, it is not us. We do not have what it takes to endure in this life. You hit us hard, we're going to fall down. You apply pressure and we're going to crack. It is not about what we have. It's not about us. It's not about our clay pot. It's about what is inside of the clay pot. That's what matters. And we only get that in response to what has freely been given to us. Hope is given in response to Jesus' death for our sin and resurrection from the grave. And the need to respond, it is so critically important to having hope in life that when Jesus was talking to Mary and Martha, He asked a question. Here's what He said. John 11, 25 and 26. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And here's Jesus' question. Do you believe this? And that's the question that I want to ask today. And I want to invite the team to come forward to prepare for communion. But do you believe this? Right? If you are a Christian, you have hope of God transforming your life now. If you're not a Christian, if you haven't accepted Christ, I want you to know that Jesus, He is in the business of life change, and there's nothing more that He wants to do than to give you hope. A hope beyond death, but hope especially now.